Old man Elias, who had spent his entire life in the quiet little town of Greendale. He was known for his strength, his quick wit, and his ability to fix anything that was broken. For as long as anyone could remember, Elias was always the one called upon to mend fences, repair roofs, and lift the heavy loads that others couldn't manage. His hands, once rough and calloused, had always been steady, his mind sharp, and his body resilient. But as the years passed, the once robust frame of the young boy who had run across the hills of Greendale with boundless energy was now bent and frail. But Elias didn't see it that way. One bright spring morning, as the sun spilled golden light over the town, Elias set out for his daily walk through the woods. It had become his routine to wander along the trails, lost in thought, remembering the days when his legs had carried him without effort. Today, however, something felt off. The ground seemed further away, the trees towering over him like giants. But Elias paid it no mind. He was a boy in his heart, after all, and boys don't grow old. His pace was slower, yes, but in his mind, he was still the young man who had once raced up the mountainside. He jogged lightly along the path, laughing to himself, enjoying the breeze on his face. But when he reached the clearing, something strange happened. The trees didn't seem to have the same welcoming embrace, and the birds singing above his head felt distant. He paused, looking around, trying to shake off the unease gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He bent down to tie his shoes, and that's when he noticed the first hint of trouble. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the laces. "What's wrong with me?" he thought. He couldn't remember the last time his fingers had acted this way. But it wasn't something to worry about. He was still strong. He was still young. Elias stood back up, feeling a sudden dizzying sense of disorientation, like the ground beneath him had shifted. The trees were farther away now, their trunks thick and towering, as though they'd grown overnight. He squinted, trying to focus, but everything around him seemed warped. He reached out to steady himself against the nearest tree, but his hand met nothing but air. The woods were too quiet now, as though the world had gone still, just for him. Panicking, he turned to run, but his legs buckled beneath him, not the swift, sure steps of his youth, but sluggish and uncoordinated. He stumbled, grasping at the air, but the more he tried to move, the more the world around him seemed to shift. Confused and breathless, he tried to call out, but his voice didn't sound like his own. It was softer, weaker, as if someone else were speaking for him. He looked down at his hands again, expecting to see his youthful, powerful hands. Instead, they were wrinkled, fragile, the skin thin as parchment. His heart skipped a beat. How had that happened? That was when the fog rolled in. It started slow, creeping in at the edges of his vision, curling like tendrils of mist. At first, he thought it was just the natural haze of the morning, but soon it consumed everything, clouding his sight, muffling his breath. He couldn't remember how long he'd been walking, but the fog felt like a prison, thick and unyielding. Inside the fog, Elias could still feel his youthful self, the boy he thought he was. He could still hear his voice, deep and strong. But every time he tried to move, to speak, to be who he remembered, the world shifted again, pulling him further into itself, further from the man he had become. It wasn't until he tried to climb the rock wall by the creek, something he had done countless times as a boy, that he realized how far he had fallen. His limbs, weak and trembling, wouldn't cooperate. His mind screamed at him to push harder, to summon the strength he knew he had, but his body betrayed him. He could hardly lift himself, and every movement sent pain shooting through his joints. And then it clicked. He wasn't a young man anymore. He wasn't the strong boy who had run up hills with a carefree laugh and a fire in his heart. He wasn't even the man who had mended things for the townsfolk for so many years. He was just an old man, trapped in a moment of time that didn't belong to him. The realization struck him with a strange, hollow pain. When did this happen? He wondered. He couldn't remember the exact moment when his youth had slipped away, when his body had betrayed him. He thought back to the last time he had felt strong, when he had fixed the old church's roof just last autumn, when the breeze had carried his laughter across the town. He hadn't noticed it then, hadn't noticed how the days and years had stolen his vitality, little by little, until there was nothing left but the shell of the man who had been. The fog was thick now, and Elias sank to his knees. He wanted to weep, but something inside of him, deep within his soul, refused to accept it. He couldn't be old, not yet. I'm still the boy, he thought. But even as the words formed in his mind, he knew they were a lie. Elias closed his eyes, feeling the weight of everything he had lost, his strength, his youth, his endless energy. He couldn't fight it anymore. The truth had come for him, and no matter how hard he tried to hold on to the boy inside, the man he had become would not let him go. When Elias finally opened his eyes, the fog began to lift. The trees returned to their familiar shape. The ground felt solid beneath his feet again. The world had returned to normal. But something had shifted in him. Something irreversible. He stood there, trembling, realizing for the first time that he was not the young boy anymore, no matter how hard he had tried to be. And in that moment, he understood that perhaps the strongest thing he could do now was accept the man he had become, even if that meant letting go of the boy who once ran so freely across the hills of Greendale. The town would still need him, in different ways. The trees would still grow, the sun would still rise. And maybe, just maybe, the fog would lift again,